It's now streaming.
Yes, we're getting started in just a little bit. Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Yona Nadelman, a Holocaust survivor from Poland. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Yona Nadelman, who will share her story with you. After Yona shares her story, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can type in your questions in the comments, and Yona will answer as many questions as possible. Yona has been in our museum for several years now, and before the pandemic, she would come and speak to school groups on a regular basis, and she has participated in all of our education programs over the years, and we're so happy to have her here on Zoom sharing her story with us. Yona, thank you so much for joining us this late morning, early afternoon. We're so honored to have you as our guest. Thank you
Well,
so much for being with us.
I'm honored that you have asked me. I'm delighted to be here and truly honored that you have asked me to speak. My assumption is that people are wondering how old I was probably when that all started. I was actually 5 years old, and I have never ever forgotten that morning when my father woke me up from a very deep sleep. It was still dark outside, and it was September 1st, 1939. And my father was an officer in the Polish army, and he was called to join, I guess, and he was taking me and my mother to the train station because we were going to be sent to the Tatra Mountains. And I kept saying, why are we going back to the mountains? We just came from there. We were there on vacation in the mountains. And my father said, because the wives and children of officers are being sent to the mountains. Well, we arrived at the train station, and there were soldiers with gas masks, giving everyone a gas mask and teaching them how to use it. And it was a very strange scene. All these men in uniform. I remember my father going on maneuvers, or I guess it was when he was participating. He would dress up in this uniform, and he looked so different. And I was probably 4 or 5 years old at the time also. Anyway, as we were being directed to the cars, which, the train cars, there was a peculiar sound that was heard, and all of a sudden we heard bombs. They did not bomb the train station. And my father grabbed me and my mother and pulled us out of the station. And he mumbled, they weren't going to target the station, just the rails. I had no idea what he was talking about, but he took me by the hand and asked me to follow him. And as we walked out of the station, he noticed there was a man with a buggy and horse and buggy standing there, I guess, waiting for sort of like a taxi, waiting for customers. And he also didn't have the time to leave. It was a very quick thing that happened, this noise and the sound. My dad sort of looked at the guy with the horse, thought about something, walked up to the front of the car, I mean, by the horse, and spoke to the owner. And the owner came down from his wherever he was sitting, and my dad pulled something out of his pocket. Guy said goodbye, and they left. And my dad said, "Get in." My mom looked at him and thought that he had gone mad. And she asked him, "Are you mad? Why did you buy this horse and buggy?" And he turned and he said to her, "Because I want to get as far away from Hitler as I can. And we're going to go east. And it's better with a horse and buggy than it would have been with a car, which my father did not own anyway. We did not have a car. So he didn't, I believe he didn't drive at the time. Anyway, we stopped off at my uncle's house, and my grandparents were there, and there was a great deal of discussions going on. And my grandfather looked at my dad and said, "I don't understand why you want to go east." And my father repeated the sentence, "I want to get as far away from Hitler as I can." And my grandfather kind of wrinkled his forehead and thought, lifted his shoulders. And I thought, yeah, he thinks my father is crazy. But we left, and my uncle decided to send his son and the nanny that was his caretaker, because my uncle's wife, the mother of Gabby, my cousin, died in childbirth. And we were very close. He was exactly a year younger than I. He was actually born the day before my birthday. And so he and another couple came with us, and we proceeded east with this horse and buggy. And as we were going eastward, there was a lot of people. There were a lot of people moving in that same direction, on bicycles, with cars, with buggies, with all kinds of walking, actually. As we were moving, whatever the road that we were on, there were German airplanes that came and shot and killed. And we were lucky enough that we were not one of them. We were not. My mother was tending to some of the people who were wounded. And I remember when we were leaving our home, my mother said, "I'm going to bring iodine and bandages." And my dad said, "Yeah, okay, but not too much stuff. Don't take too much stuff." And so she had some stuff that she could help the people who were wounded. I do not remember how long we were on the way. We stopped every once in a while to feed the horse. We would stop on a farm and my mom would buy eggs and milk, and they would go and the milk would come directly from the cow, because they didn't have milk or refrigeration. So they would say, "You want some milk? Okay." So we had all kinds of things happening while we were traveling. But all in all, the incidents were not life-threatening, other than the fact that once we had to go through a burning forest, and my father stood up on the front of the horse, the buggy, and the horse moved. We went through a burning wood. The wood was burning at the top. The trees were burning at the top. And I don't know how long we were traveling, but since we left, probably on September the 2nd, the Second World War started September 1st, 1939. And then we left that day, that same day. And then we traveled for probably weeks, 2-3 weeks, I don't know. But one day we had not yet arrived at our destination, which was Tarnopol. It was in southeastern Poland, not too far from the Ukrainian border. And my father's family came from there. So my dad had his brother and sister living in that town. And we had not yet arrived, but we were staying for the night in an empty house. People had probably done the same thing we had done. And in the morning, as we were waking up, my dad heard a peculiar noise, and he looked outside, sort of slightly not squarely out of the window, and he turned around, his eyebrows lifted, his eyes wide open, and saying, "Oh my God, these are Russian soldiers. They are wearing the Red Star on their caps." And everybody, the people that were with us, said, "What? Russian soldiers?" And my father had a doctorate in political science, so he must have had knowledge of things that were happening during that time that other people probably were not paying attention to. And I guess Hitler and Stalin decided to divide Poland between them. So the Germans came from the west and the Russians came from the east. And we were now in the Russian zone, the Russian occupied zone. And one of the funny things was that when we passed through a river, we were all very wet and everything we had was wet. And when we stopped off the next night at an empty house, my mother wanted to cook something, but no one had anything to make fire with. Matches, lighters, everything was wet and not functioning. So my dad said to me, "I'm going to put you out the window, and I want you to go up to the truck, and I will teach you in Russian how to say, 'Please, may I have some matches?'" And so he taught me, he said, "You say, 'Спички, пожалуйста.'" And so out I went, and I bravely looked at they were all young guys, young soldiers. And I said, "Спички, пожалуйста." And every soldier looked in their pockets, and out came a zillion boxes of matches. So that was an experience that I will never forget. And it was very nice. And we proceeded to Tarnopol. And when my father went to sell the horse and buggy, they offered him a pittance. And he said, "Why? It's a pretty good horse. Why are you offering me so little money?" And one of the men said, "Well, you know, he's blind." And my father said, "What?" He said, "Your horse is blind." And so we understood why he wasn't afraid to go through the burning woods, whereas all the other people who were standing there never dared to go through. So my dad had to laugh that he had bought a horse and a blind horse with a buggy, and that we traveled through, half of Poland with this blind horse. My parents and I settled in with my father's brother and sister, and my aunt, my father's sister, was a widow. She had two grown sons, and she was older than my dad. And my dad's brother was younger, and he had a son whose name was Jacob. We called him Kuba. And he was a little older than I, but we kind of made friends pretty quickly. What I did not know, because I guess I was just too young to have heard or known about it, was that surprise that my dad offered me when we arrived the next day or two. He said, I'm going to take you and show you something. So he took me to the family business, which I did not know. But when I walked into that big factory, I smelled something absolutely divine. It smelled of chocolate and sugar. And my dad turned to me and said, you see, our grandfather, my father, and my brother now is running. This is a factory where we make chocolates and candies and ice cream and waffles and God knows what else. Anyway, I was shocked and absolutely overtaken with joy that here I had this family that was making chocolates and all the goodies that a chocolate factory makes. So my parents and I settled in. They were pretty well off. The family was pretty well off. So there were several apartments in the building that they owned. And they were sufficiently large to accommodate two families. So we stayed with my uncle, my father's brother, who had the young son. And my father tried to find work. The Russians were pretty much settled in, and it was altogether a pretty normal life that we were leading. My mom sent me to a dance school, and there was the ballerina who was teaching us dance was Russian, so she spoke Russian to us. And my father found work working for a Russian commissar because he was fluent both in German and in Russian. He spoke and wrote and read these languages and several others. And since he was fluent in German, it was important because the Russians and the Germans at this point were friends. They had made a pact between, I guess, Hitler and Stalin that they were going to be friends. So my dad was working and my mom was trying to adjust. She missed her parents and, they were by then able to communicate. I don't know if it was only by mail or if there was telephone service. That I don't remember. Unfortunately, sometime later, and I have absolutely no dates other than that first day of September 1939 when the war started and my life changed so dramatically. And it was summertime, and my parents were talking about people disappearing, and they thought that maybe they went into hiding or they changed locations, but all of a sudden they would say, Jacob and Maria, they disappeared. They were there and then they were not. And everybody was sort of wondering. And then one day, there was a knock on the door in the middle of the night. and Russian people in uniforms, I don't know what they were, came and asked for my father, my mother, and a child. And my father turned to my aunt, who was standing there. She had apparently opened the door to let them in. And he turned to her and he said, Regina, why is this child standing there? I mean, it's the middle of the night and she should be in bed. Would you please put her to bed? So my aunt turned around, picked me, by the hand and put me to bed in her room. I did not understand at all what was happening. My parents were being deported to Siberia. Apparently, my father was an intellectual. He had a bunch of doctorates in law, political science, all kinds of different things. And he was on the list to be deported to Siberia. Whether or not he knew about those people who had disappeared, that they were also deported to Siberia or not, I don't know. We never discussed it. I mean, we didn't, My parents were taken away. I remained with my aunt and uncle. I remember being very sick, not being able to sleep, not being able to eat, and everybody hovering over me. And then I remember one day looking out the window and there was a pigeon sitting there and looking at me, and I laughed. And so I became normal. And my aunt and my uncle and my cousins were very kind to me. And, I was still, playing with the kids and doing things. And one day, my aunt, Clara, her name was Junia, we called her, came and she said, her son, who was my playmate, came and said, listen, my mom and I were going to visit my grandma. You want to come with us? I said, where are you going? And they said, well, it's a town called Zwatruf, and it's not too far, but we're going to take the train. We're going to go and visit my mother's brother lives there, so we're going to have fun. You should come with us. I said, okay, I'll come with you. And so I did. And they owned, the mother of my aunt owned a jewelry store, which was kind of fun for a little girl to go in and look at the jewelry. And the uncle was sort of a, how should I put it, sportsman. He had big muscles. He was very strong. And I don't know what he did, but every day there was a training of how to go into the cellar and how to get out and what to do while you were in the cellar if there was an air raid. Well, in Tarnopol, we hadn't thought about that, or they hadn't talked about it. I don't know why, whether there was a reason because it was a different location or what was the reason, but we never heard about it. So we would go into the cellar and we would stay there, and the light, and they would turn on the radio and they would say, this is what, you have to do. And so it was kind of a new thing. And I don't remember exactly how long we were there. Maybe a month. I'm not sure. I don't know. And all of a sudden, there was an air raid. And the bombers came. And they bombed the little town. And we were in the cellar. And somebody yelled, the building has been hit. The building has been hit. Get out. Everybody out. So we did. But it wasn't burning. For some reason, it was hit, but in a way that there was no fire. And Grandma, Rachel, her name was, turned around, walked back into the building, went up to the first floor, and went behind the stove, sort of behind a heat-making device, and pulled out things from behind there. And then she said, I can't reach the last one, it's too far. So she said, you're thinner, see if you can reach it. And I did. And she left just before me. And when I walked out of that room and wanted to go down the stairs were no longer there. They had fallen out. And I came back into the room and I was screaming, crying, I'm stuck. I can't get out. Where is everybody? So I went to the window and I screamed. And a man came from another apartment on the same floor. And he said, don't worry, little girl, I will help you. We will jump together. And so he did. And we landed safely on the ground. And everybody started talking about the fact that the Germans were there. Well, everybody knew that half of Poland had been under the German control. And what was happening in that part of Poland, I guess the adults knew about. We were sort of being very quiet, not doing very much, but they became very visible. The Nazis were there, the Gestapo was there, and they were very visible with their uniforms and their polished boots and their loud commands that they gave, and so very different from anything that we had experienced with the Russian soldiers that were occupying Tarnopol. And that was at that time that I experienced the first understanding of why I could never understand why my father was so afraid of this Hitler. Who was this Hitler? My father, who was such a brave, special, my father could do anything. He could move worlds. Why was he so afraid of this Hitler? And all of a sudden I understood, because they were taking all of these able-bodied men. Everybody who was able-bodied had to go to work, and they were digging enormous ditches. And I don't know what these ditches were for. I didn't know. But there was this young man, I don't know how old he was. He may have been in his late teens or early 20s, but he was a cripple. His hands were like this, and he couldn't move them. They were paralyzed. And he sat with his head, hanging sideways. And one of the German Gestapo people came up to him and said, and why aren't you digging, working the ditches? And he smiled. He smiled and he said, I can't. I am paralyzed. I can't hold anything. And the German looked at him and said, well, then I guess you're useless. Pulled out his gun, put it to the forehead of this poor little young man and shot him. And he dropped to the floor, limp. And I remember feeling like I couldn't understand what had happened. Why did this man, this mean, horrible man, kill this poor guy who couldn't hold a shovel in his hands? And this was repeated several times in that particular time at the very beginning. I think that it was in June of 1941, because I've learned since then that The Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September. The Russians came in on the 17th. and the second wave, I don't know what, they called it, was in June 22nd of 1941. And here we were in Złotów with grandma, and my aunt's husband, my uncle, was in Tarnopol, and she wanted to go back. They wouldn't let her. They wouldn't let her travel. And then she went and she got all dressed up with a little hat sort of on sideways on her head. She put on her best clothes and made makeup and everything, and she left. And when she came back, she said, I got the permits. I got the permits, we're leaving. We left on the train. We came to Tarnopol, and the city had already a ghetto. So we arrived immediately. We went to the ghetto. I couldn't understand why we couldn't go. We were locked up. And it so happened that our building was inside the ghetto. And so one part of the building was inside the ghetto, but the building went through to another street, which was outside the ghetto. So there were always, I don't know if they were Gestapo or they were what, but they were always around. Constantly we saw the uniforms. But little by little, my uncle was still going to work, and I was not going to dance classes anymore. And my cousins were teaching me all kinds of things. They were teaching me to read. My father had taught me to read when I was 3. So I knew how to read, but I didn't know certain things. So they were teaching me how to add 2 and 2 and keeping me occupied. One of them was at university in Lemberg, in Lviv, and the other one was at home, the older ones. My aunt was teaching me to knit because she had a knitting machine. And she said, no, you can't touch the machine because it could cut off a finger, but I will teach you how to knit with knitting needles. And so she taught me, she gave me yarn and she taught me how to knit. All that was good until they were killing people who were standing in line for food because there was no food anymore. And there was nothing. You couldn't get anything in the Tarnopol ghetto. And I remember my aunt taking me to someone's house where they were collecting shoes. Those children who had outgrown their shoes were giving to this woman. So everybody went there and hoped to find a pair of shoes that fit them because there were no stores. There was nowhere to buy anything. Apparently, my uncle in Krakow was in a better position. He was in a ghetto, in the Krakow ghetto, and my grandparents were in a small town outside of Krakow, and they were not in a ghetto. It was in a small town, not in a ghetto. And apparently, they were communicating with my aunt in Tarnopol, and my uncle decided that he wanted to get me out of the ghetto and to my grandparents who lived in Słomniki, a small town outside of Krakow. How they communicated to this day, I couldn't tell you. But one day, my aunt said, okay, here is what we're going to do. I'm going to dress you up really, really warm. It was the middle of winter. Everything was white. Snow was all over and all over the ghetto. Outside, there was a road outside the ghetto, a street or a road, and it was white because nobody was driving or walking there. It was like a carpet of white. And my aunt took me not too close to the gate and said, okay, here are your gloves, here's your shawl, here's your this, here's your that.